Are you managing your FM risks? If not, the consequences could be huge. In this video, I interview Ian Giles, director at Encred, who has over 30 years experience in the FM industry. In this conversation, Ian shares his knowledge on how to effectively assess and manage risks in your buildings, how to conduct a condition survey, and how to effectively prepare for an FM audit. Let's jump straight into the interview with Ian. I'm going to now welcome Ian Giles to the webinar. So for those in the audience who don't know you, Ian, could you introduce yourself in your own words?
Thanks, Liam. Hello everyone. I'm Ian Giles. I'm a director at Encred. I'm a chartered engineer and fellow at CIBS, and I sit on several committees and panels within CIBS, and I've been in and around the FM industry for over 40 years now. So hello everyone.
It's amazing. And today, Ian, we're going to be discussing how to assess and manage risks within FM. So if anyone does have any questions for Ian, please do put them in the chat. And if we don't answer them today, we'll answer them in a document that we'll send out to you next week. So every question will be answered. And Ian, I wonder to start off, how do you deal with constantly changing legislation, and then what impact does that have on keeping your maintenance plans up to date and making sure that any risks that your buildings carry are mitigated or or at least assessed?
Well, I guess the first thing to sort of really say is how many changes there are in any given year. And that varies obviously from year to year, because some years when things like the tragedy at Grenfell happened, the outcome of that has more impact on legislation and regulation than other years when things don't happen. But typically from experience, there's probably in the order of 200 pieces of legislation, regulation, ACOP, that type of thing that change within any given year. So the size of the problem to keep up to date is enormous, or it's fairly enormous. And there are different ways that you can keep up to date. You can subscribe to things like the HSE, and you can make it more specific about sort of information that you want when changes happen, within sectors. I mean, major legislation changes normally come out in things like the trade press, and people on site or within a site, they would probably be part of a professional body now. Most people would expect that. And within your sort of own CPD, you will have the chance to look at changing legislation. Also, parts of the workforce like Gas Safe and NIC, EIC, they will be helping their members with changes. But you also, some of these changes with that 200, and that's what it's averaged out over the last 5 or 6 years. Within that, some are fairly minimal impacts. Some will have impacts on the design. Some will have impacts on maintenance. It's a huge job to keep up with everything. I mean, that's one thing that SFG do, and the other thing is you've got to understand what the piece of legislation is and what it's going to impact on what assets you've got. And bearing in mind something, if it was like a refrigerant change, that's going to impact on quite a few of your assets potentially. If it was the wiring regs, again, that's going to have a fairly large impact, where some you can spend hours and hours and hours looking through British standards or new British standards to find out what's happening. But the worry is that you miss something. So certainly, sort of SFG 20 certainly helps you out in that department.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that some of these changes are so significant that almost it might, knock you off course, or it could, cause you to need to manage risk in a slightly different way. So if you think about the specific risks that are associated with any change, like what what's the mindset there when you're looking at, okay, here's a change that's come in and here's a risk that I have associated with that. How do you think about managing that to change the processes that you've got to ensure that you're managing that risk correctly?
I think you need to know what it is that we're talking about. So, if it was sort of something that's not going to impact on safety of the building or safety of the people within the building, then it comes sort of obviously further down the line. Where if it's something like with the Building Safety Act, then it's something that it affects every building, let alone tall buildings, it's any building, and you've got to be sure that you're following what that new legislation or regulation is saying, and you've got to be able to prove that you're doing it. So whether that is in terms of the actions you're taking, the testing regime that you're undertaking, and the way that you document that you've been doing it, or that within the risk assessment that you undertake, because there could be some things. I was talking to a client this morning. We were talking about showers, of all things, and the fact of how they could or couldn't afford to descale shower heads. And of course, it does make a difference. It's a simple little one to some extent, but it does make a difference if you're in a soft or a hard water area. And I think it's all of these things. It's doing the risk assessment and make it personal to your business, because you can do standard risk assessments, but actually, if you're in the business of security and you're like prisons or something, then that security side of things is a far higher requirement than maybe in somebody else's business. So it is having the ability to have a bespoke risk assessment.
Absolutely, and that's an interesting lens to look at this through, because some sectors are going to be more highly regulated than others in terms of what they need to do for their buildings, and I wonder if from your experience there is like one big risk that you see across the board that almost every organization or every building is holding at any one time. Like, is there one particular risk that stands out to you, that people need to be mitigating or focusing on?
I think that, the one that really is with us all at the moment is fire. And I think is fire compartmentation. And when you look, I mean, outside of any risk, whether you don't know you've got an asset on site, because that's always that's it's important. So if you don't know what you've got, you don't know how to maintain it. But with fire, fire and understand, when you're doing a survey, it's not only looking at the condition of the assets, but you really want to be looking at sort of fire and statutory regulation to make sure that you're compliant. So the hardest thing is the hours that it can take. If you've got, say, a hospital or something like that, just to do the fire compartmentation checks, it really is a fourth bridge job. And the difficulty is because it's so labor intensive and difficult and intrusive, is it always done? And you only really, the sad part is you find out sometimes when it's too late.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? A risk that you're carrying that is not mitigated, and not up to standard, the consequences could be huge.
Absolutely
And we
catastrophic.
see it so many times, don't we?
everyone, you need to know what your risks are. I think that's the thing. Within any building, you've got assets that are going to give you risk, such as pressure systems, gas systems, any of those sort of systems that without maintenance are going to cause you a problem. You've got other risks, that come in, sort of environmental risks that where if you don't manage something, your sort of people are going to be looking at your business and viewing it in a not particularly pleasant way because you're sort of doing things that are harmful to the environment. So whatever which way you look at it, you've got to understand the risk and what if you don't do something, what are the implications of what you're not going to do. And I don't think any of us want to be sort of standing for the corporate manslaughter or something like that because we haven't done something. So I think by at least knowing what you've got on site, what is the minimum requirement, to keep you out of jail and statutory legal. You don't want to be over and you don't want to be under maintaining. So it's knowing what you've got and being able to look at all of the risks and the implications of failure. And then from that, hopefully people understand that you have to do certain things. That if you're going to stay compliant, you've got to do, this amount, and that's going to cost you that amount. And it would be, I would certainly be looking to the top of any organisation and saying, oh, okay, then, well, which ones do you want to tell us not to maintain? And everything needs to be recorded, in terms of why someone is telling you not to do something.
Absolutely, and I wonder, Ian, is that piece of not every piece of maintenance being done, like how and being told, this is what we need to prioritize versus this. Is that a factor in why a maintenance backlog has become so significant in some sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think it's like everything. It's where budgets get cut. And we all know that the maintenance budget is one of the first ones to go. I think we've also seen in the last few years, the price of energy. So revenue budgets that are there are all being pinched because, sort of the energy part of the revenue has gone up through the roof. But the difficulty you get is if you're not careful, you get caught in the sort of the reactive maintenance sort of cycle. But I think also when you are aware of what assets you've got and the condition of those assets, then you're going to know you've got a backlog issue. And I think that the thing being is that within all sort of central government buildings, there's a requirement that they issued a document, the Facilities Management Standard 002 Asset Data, and I think that was issued in 2022. There's a requirement in there that all government departments need to have had an asset register undertaken, a condition survey, and a risk assessment of all of their buildings. Well, when you've done that, you can't ignore the fact that you've got a backlog issue, and I believe within from the most recent records within the health service, that backlog at the moment is 11.6 billion. It's a big number. It's a huge number, but in some ways, at least is it the correct number? Is it we can all ask that question, but at least it's known, and I think lack of investment in any organisation and anything is going to lead to backlog. Getting into a reactive cycle, you can, all you're doing is you're taking your people away from doing preventive maintenance because they're just doing reaction stuff. The difficulty is when you're not doing proper maintenance, sometimes energy costs go up because poorly maintained machinery probably doesn't run as efficiently as maintained machinery. Similarly, sort of your economic life, if you maintain something, is far longer than if you don't maintain something. And I think we've all seen this with buildings. We look at CIBSE Guide M, and we start looking. We look at an air handling unit, something probably between 15 and 20 years, probably economic life. But actually, you see stuff that goes back probably from the 70s that's still there. It must be very inefficient, and because of that, you'd really count that within your backlog.
And Ian, I would be very interested in your perspective on, what the first steps are into conducting a good condition survey of your assets, and then maybe think a little bit more broad, how does that fit into building the right foundations to be able to manage risks effectively within your building?
Well, I think my thoughts on it are really you should be looking at condition yearly. I mean, with any asset survey, it's a dynamic document or a dynamic thing. So as bits get changed, you should be changing stuff within that document. So you need to keep the asset register up to date at all times. And that is the foundation of anything, really. It's, the condition is to, you then need to have a common language within the asset register, because, far too often, when you get a lot of people inputting into the same asset register, so if you've got multiple buildings on a site, so you've got a multiple sort of you've got surveyors going out, you've got to use a common language, because if you're not careful, I mean, one that I've seen sort of not that many years ago, but 370 odd lines of asset register, and for air conditioning sort of split type units, there were 7 different titles used to describe the same asset in different parts. Well, that's crazy, because then if you map those against SFG 20 or some industry standard, the chances of you getting it right every time, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, I think the one thing is, making sure your asset register is right, and then using a condition ranking that is, an industry standard. So, I mean, CIBS do them, BSRIA do them, British Standard 8544 has them in, but you need a condition. Now the NHS estates did a document which is a risk-based methodology for establishing and managing backlog, and they actually do condition not only for assets, well, they're all assets, but mechanical and electrical assets, but they also do a condition survey for fire rating as well, which is another one to look at, and at least then you would know, far more on the fire safety part of your building. But you need to sort of understand what you've got in your building, look at the condition of it, keep an eye on the condition, certainly as yearly. And that's going to change more if you're not maintaining as well. And again, it's looking at the assets that matter to you. What are going to have more impact on your building? What's going to have a more impact on the energy within your building? Because things like air handling units, it may be that you look at not replacing the whole of the air handling unit, but these things at some point, you might look at the controls, and I think things like retro commissioning are so important because you set up a building to a set of design standards 20 years ago. We all know that weather patterns are changing and things need to be re-looked at. Are those design temperatures still correct? Are things being done slightly differently? And I think we look in places like Hong Kong, where it's a legal requirement every 5 years to do a retro commission within the building. We've got to change and think about that for ourselves here, because things are changing, and rather than guessing at it, is look at how other people do these things, because the running costs of buildings are going up through the roof. So again, it's looking at the assets that are going to dictate that and work on those, make sure their condition is right. And there are going to be lots of other assets that maybe you don't spend as much time on, but it's knowing it, and by from your condition survey is look at the risk assessment, undertake a risk assessment. What's going to happen if that does fail? Is anyone going to get hurt? Is anyone going to be disadvantaged in any way? What goes on? And by doing that, you've got information that allows you then to make a judgment. And if you don't have that information, you can't make that judgment.
Absolutely. And impact feels like a key word in there. What's the impact if the risk does become a reality? I think that's always a good question to think about. And
it can really, it affects everything from, you don't want someone knocking on the door from the HSE telling you you've done something, or you're doing something incorrectly. It's finding what you can and what you can't do, and managing it properly.
Absolutely. If we move now to think about FM audits, how would you suggest that somebody can get the best preparation in place to be able to handle an FM audit?
Well, I think with most of them nowadays, we know there's going to be an FM audit, and we know when it's going to be because it's announced. It's not normally it's not a surprise sort of audit, and you're probably also going to understand is what you're going to be audited on, and whether that's sort of compliance with the contract, whether it's sort of the equipment condition, whether it's compliance with legislation, sort of making sure that the equipment has been maintained, how it's been maintained, or whether it's staff training for things like F-gas or whatever it would be. So I think the first thing is it's going to happen. What people have come to look for, and I think the biggest thing to get ready is the information, because what people are going to want to see, that you are maintaining your emergency lighting. So you'll have your logbook, and you'll have any certificates for that system. What we find often when you go to site to do an FM audit is you can't always get to the information because it's not held on site. I mean, it's great, you've got cloud-based systems, and that's terrific, as long as the person on site has access to that system so that he can pull out, or she can pull out, the information that you're looking for. But you need to, one of the things we want to look at is, well, what are you actually doing, on your emergency lighting? And, can you prove that that particular light fitting, in the lift lobby, it's had its monthly, or it's had its 12 monthly, whatever it is. So, it's going in there and being able to give the auditor the information that he's likely to request, I think it's probably it. You don't want to be told when you go on site doing an audit that, well, I can't give it to you for 2 or 3 weeks. because cynically you could start to think, well, hang on a minute, within 2 or 3 weeks you can make an awful lot of this up. So I think I think the thing is don't don't try and fool the auditor, because they're going to find out probably, if they're worth their salt, that there's an issue. So I think that the main thing is having that information ready.
So someone's asking, what are the key factors to consider when developing a facilities management risk assessment aside from equipment maintenance?
Well, you've got to look at the consequences of anything you're going to, so there's a consequence score you're going to look at, and a likelihood score. But things that you look at are, apart from actually maintaining the equipment, is impact on the environment. You could look at health and safety issues, injury to people, injury to the building system, whatever it is, what it's going to do to the business in terms of business continuity. If you suddenly lose power for the whole, how are you going to continue to run that business? And the operational sort of impacts that has. I mean, I think this, the one thing with any risk assessment is being able to make it bespoke to you and exactly what that is. And the more you know your business, the more you realise what's important within that business, and those are the factors that you can then risk assess, because it will be different for everybody. And you will highly rate some things, and you'll go through and do your risk assessment and an analysis of the consequences if you don't do something. You will put in the consequential scores, you look at the likelihoods, and you'll give yourself that will generate a score. That's typically the way risk assessments. And then what you can do is you can understand from where that score is how you can manage that risk. Is it if it's fairly low, you might be able to just add it into what you normally do. Similarly, if it's something that's going to potentially fail in, say, less than 4 years, you're going to have to put some capital aside, or go for capital to replace something or do something else.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for answering that. I had some great questions in from the audience. If you could give people just one message about managing their FM risks, what is that one message, and why is it that?
I think the recurring thing that comes back through the whole thing is you've got to know what assets you've got. I think the most important thing is that you need an asset register that isn't stuck in time, that is dynamic, that changes. You need to know the condition of your assets, whatever they are. You need to know the risk. So you've got the condition, you need to know the risk and what the implication is to your business, building, whatever it is you're running. You need to know that if you lost that, what was going to happen. And I think I think the underlying thing is you need to know it's there before you can do anything. And that to me is the most important thing for people to do, is to know exactly what they've got, what condition it's in, what the risk is. And if you know all of those, then you can manage and you can decide with either yourself or with colleagues, however it is, what you're going to do. But ignorance is certainly no answer in any of this any longer.
Absolutely. And I've got one final question that has come in from the audience just before we finish. So what are the ideal customer feedback mechanisms that we can effectively use in FM?
it's feedback to the auditor, then it would be sort of information, proof of what's done. I mean, too often, you see sort of like work orders, carry out maintenance for 12 months. Well, there's not enough detail there to tell you. You need something like, maintain to SFG 20 or maintain to manufacturer's instructions. Even that's a bit woolly, because it's not pointing you into, well, what SFG 20 task is it, or what manufacturer's instructions are we talking about? I think it's having having the knowledge of what that person is doing, and can you prove that it's been done? I think so those are the feedback. I think the other thing that with feedback that we don't often get is, if you go in to do an audit and you find something has been or is down and needs repairs, is getting that feedback loop to say, oh, it's been done or it's been replaced, and actually it's the asset register has changed to reflect that new piece of equipment in it. Equally, I never take any of the old stuff off. I might score through it in an asset register, but again, it's if you've got multiple pumps of a certain type, it's quite useful to see which ones are failing as opposed to ones that don't fail as often, because if you're going to be replacing stuff, you want to know what's the most reliable.
Did you enjoy this video? Subscribe today to get the latest tips from SFG 20, the industry standard for building maintenance.